Hey everyone! Tonight we begin our journey into a world quietly reimagined. A world not disrupted by the clattering of defeat, but lulled by the steady, inevitable advance of imperial destiny. Tonight, we explore the moment where everything might have changed. The muddy fields of Waterloo not soaked in loss, but rippling gently beneath the banners of triumph. Let your eyes close gently as we drift into June of 1815. Listen to the hush before the thunder. Feel the breath of wind over fields dampened by days of rain. Picture the plains of Belgium, the crossroads near Mont-Saint-Jean, the silent rows of soldiers adjusting their gear, the creak of cannon wheels shifting in wet earth. We are not in our own timeline now. Something has changed. In this quiet divergence, imagine a morning where the clouds parted just a little sooner, where the ground dried just enough to permit the heavy tread of artillery without the sinking, sucking resistance of sodden turf. It is a morning where the Grande Armée, meticulously arrayed, moved with a precision regained, not lost. The artillery, Napoleon's old companions in glory, are positioned with greater care. The horses do not stumble, the caissons do not mire. The rain had ceased, and with it the hesitation. The battlefield itself shifts subtly. Where once the muddy terrain slowed and scattered formations, here it holds firm enough to allow coordination. Infantry lines advance more deliberately. Cavalry awaits the signal without growing restless. The emperor, mounted and observant, sees not disorder, but opportunity. And in this moment, fate leans, ever so slightly, toward the familiar silhouette of the man in gray. At Hougoumont, where bitter fighting historically drained French strength for little reward, a single spark changes the course of hours. A fire, accidental or perhaps not, spreads through the gatehouse by late morning. The defenders falter under smoke and flame. Jerome Bonaparte's troops press forward, and the orchard is lost before noon. British troops, recognizing the exposed flank, draw reserves from the center. What was once a fixed point of Wellington's line begins to loosen at the edges. Elsewhere, Marshal Ney delays the fateful charge that, in another world, would have squandered men and horses alike. Here he waits for the signal, waits for the guns to soften the enemy line. When the cavalry does ride, it rides not in vain, but in tandem with artillery salvos and disciplined volleys. Columns of infantry follow, pressing into the spaces opened by precise force. The British line does not shatter all at once, but it bends, slowly, visibly. To the east, where the fate of the day depended not just on one battle, but on the arrival of another army, a small change unfolds with vast consequence. Grouchy, ever maligned in our history, receives word of Blücher's position sooner than he did before. Perhaps it is a courier who rides more swiftly, or a scout who returns ahead of schedule. No matter the detail, the result is the same. Grouchy's men engaged the Prussian vanguard earlier, stalling them near Waver. Blücher, valiant and implacable, finds his path to Waterloo blocked. And instead of bolstering Wellington at 4 in the afternoon, his advance is slowed until nightfall. By the time the British right is overextended and their left strained under pressure, no salvation arrives from the east. Wellington, stoic and unflinching, surveys a field where the familiar rhythm of battle has lost its balance. His line, thinned to hold the flanks, finds itself exposed in the center. He contemplates, quietly, whether the next attack might pierce the line entirely. It does, not with fury, but with inevitability. The Imperial Guard, long held in reserve, finally steps forward, marching not with desperation but with certainty. The drums do not thunder. They murmur, slow and methodical. The bayonets gleam in the pale light, advancing into history as it rewrites itself. The British withdraw, in good order at first, then with rising urgency. By evening, the ridge is lost, the crossroads abandoned, and the road to Brussels lies open. Napoleon does not pursue rashly. He does not need to. Victory, full and clear, has returned to him. In the aftermath, Europe does not scream in panic, but exhales in disbelief. The coalition, always a fragile gathering of mutual fear, begins to dissolve at its seams. Britain, bloodied and weary, retreats into calculation. Prussia, its field army bruised and scattered, considers its limits. Austria hesitates. Russia watches and waits. Napoleon enters Paris not as an exile returned, but as a sovereign restored. The city, tense and quiet, offers neither jubilation nor protest. It simply accepts. The emperor returns to the Tuileries Palace not as a revolutionary force, but as a stabilizing presence. The chaos of the 100 Days never truly materialized. Instead, there is a sense of continuity, of restoration not merely of a man, but of a structure, an empire that might yet endure. His ministers return, Talleyrand with eyes narrowed in cautious re-entry, Fouché with calculated allegiance, Cambacérès with renewed purpose. The machinery of state hums back to life with practiced ease. Prefects are confirmed, administrative councils convened, and regional reports compiled. France, long accustomed to instability, settles once more into the rhythm of imperial rule. Far from the battlefield, in the diplomatic salons of Brussels, the outlines of a new accord begin to form. British delegates arrive not with ultimatums, but with contingencies. The Treaty of Brussels, a hypothetical relic of this altered timeline, proposes the unthinkable: peace. Britain retains her empire across the seas. Napoleon is recognized as Emperor of the French. The Low Countries are absorbed into the imperial domain. The Bourbons drift further into obscurity, and the continental map, tattered and redrawn too many times, settles into a new, unfamiliar shape. The people, exhausted by decades of upheaval, accept, not all with joy, but with a quiet understanding that perhaps this, at last, is a form of order they can endure. In the provinces, royalist murmurs begin to rise. In Aquitaine, in Vendée, in scattered villages where the fleur-de-lis still clings to chapel walls, there is resistance, but it is no longer organized, no longer broad. It is sporadic, rural, tired. Napoleon, unwilling to waste lives, orders not purges, but reconciliations. Amnesties are issued to the cooperative. Land grants are confirmed for those willing to serve. The empire, at its core, does not punish, it absorbs. And across the continent, ripples continue outward. In Vienna, Metternich frowns at a world he cannot stabilize. In London, Parliament debates not invasion, but trade. In Berlin, recovery takes precedence. In Warsaw, in Milan, in Barcelona, the imperial presence is again felt, not with force, but with structure, with roads, with officials bearing the imperial seal. The Grande Armée, reconstituted, is no longer a desperate war machine. It is an instrument of order. Garrisons are deployed to critical junctures: bridges, fortresses, customs posts. The conscription rolls are rebalanced. Officers are rotated. The military becomes not the harbinger of conquest, but the spine of permanence. By the end of 1815, Napoleon no longer fights to reclaim power. He holds it. The world, altered by hours on a Belgian plain, begins to reshape itself around him. And so we leave this first chapter, not with the sharp report of muskets or the distant thunder of cannon, but with the slow toll of a church bell in a quiet Parisian square, signaling vespers on a summer evening. The day is done, the victory is held, and the empire breathes anew. Imagine, if you will, Paris in the weeks after victory. Not a city in chaos, but one in quiet anticipation. The streets, damp with July rains, echo not with revolution, but with order. The tricolor flies without defiance. The boulevards bear no barricades. There is a strange, almost eerie calm as citizens return to their routines with cautious resolve. In shop windows, portraits of the emperor reappear, not newly printed, but retrieved from storage, dusted off, and framed once more with deliberate precision. Inside the Tuileries, Napoleon does not celebrate. He plans. He walks the marbled corridors with hands clasped behind his back, dictating not proclamations of conquest, but memoranda of reform. He knows that the greatest threat to his reign now is not foreign invasion, but domestic fragility. And so, even as the ink dries on the Treaty of Brussels, his mind turns inward, to the careful rebuilding of an empire not on the battlefield, but in the offices and counting houses of France. The treaty itself, signed on the 2nd of October, is as much performance as diplomacy. It recognizes the obvious. France has won, but only just. Britain retains her global reach, her ships, her colonies, her distant influence. France retains the continent. Belgium, formally annexed, is not merely an acquisition, but a buffer, a strategic spine that reinforces French security against northern incursion. The Dutch monarchy retreats into quiet exile. The Low Countries, long contested, are now administered from Paris, with Napoleonic prefects replacing governors loyal to the House of Orange. Maps are redrawn in schoolbooks. Borders become abstractions. The people, wearied by generations of shifting rule, accept the new order not with joy, but with resignation. Within France, the emperor's attention turns to architecture, not of buildings, but of systems. The machinery of state must not merely function, it must hum with the calm assurance of longevity. The constitution of the year Dauphine is revisited. Where once it declared an emperor by plebiscite, it is now revised by consultation with a newly summoned council of ministers. The changes are subtle, almost imperceptible, a clause here, a phrasing there. But beneath the surface, the real work takes place. Centralization of power, cloaked in the language of continuity. Prefects across the departments are reconfirmed or quietly replaced. New provincial reports are required, monthly, not quarterly, delivered in triplicate to Paris. The Ministry of the Interior, along the nervous system of Bonapartist governance, expands its reach. An invisible web of communication stretches from the Alps to the Pyrenees, from Brittany to the banks of the Rhine. It is not surveillance in the brutal sense, but awareness. The emperor does not crush opposition. He outpaces it. The economy, still fragile from years of war and retreat, becomes the next priority. The Banque de France, given expanded charter authority, begins to regulate interest rates more directly. State-backed loans are issued to textile mills in Rouen and Mulhouse, to metallurgical foundries in Lorraine, to canal companies along the Loire. Taxation is simplified but broadened. The Cadastre, the National Land Registry, is quietly updated to reflect ownership changes since 1814. Landowners, uncertain of their titles during the Bourbon interlude, are reassured. Stability returns, not with fanfare, but with signature and seal. Agricultural policy is adjusted. New incentives are offered for grain production in the Limagne and wine export from Bordeaux. Trade with neutral states, Sweden, Denmark, the Ottoman Empire, is quietly encouraged. Napoleon, once a general of lightning campaigns, now becomes an administrator of slow reform. His empire ceases to expand by sword and instead grows roots through commerce and infrastructure. In the countryside, traces of royalist resistance flicker in the night. Small gatherings in Vendée chapels, whispered conversations in village inns, white cockades pinned to hidden tunics. But the response is measured. Marshal Davout, returned from Hamburg with a reputation for discipline, is placed in command of Western departments. He issues no proclamations of vengeance. Instead, he visits local councils, attends mass with village priests, and offers amnesties for cooperation. Rebellion is not crushed. It is smothered in bureaucratic embrace. In the realm of education, the emperor looks to legacy. He expands the imperial lycée system, ordering the construction of 4 new academies in Lyon, Nantes, Marseille, and Dijon. The curriculum is uniform: history, mathematics, law, Latin, and the philosophy of state. A new generation of administrators begins to emerge, their minds shaped not by revolution or restoration, but by imperial permanence. Schoolchildren recite lines from Caesar, but think in terms of prefectures and departments. Citizenship becomes a curriculum. Loyalty becomes a lesson. Lucien Bonaparte, once estranged from his brother, is recalled to oversee the Ministry of Instruction. Their reconciliation is quiet, almost ceremonial. Lucien, always more idealistic than Marshal, brings a sense of gravitas to the imperial universities. He commissions textbooks, convenes educational councils, and insists on provincial access to higher learning. The empire, in this vision, is not merely a state. It is a civilization project. Napoleon's family, long scattered and tarnished by dubious thrones abroad, are reorganized. Joseph, formerly King of Spain, is assigned to Milan, not as monarch, but as imperial viceroy of Italy. His role is administrative, not sovereign. He oversees a careful integration of Lombardy into the French system: new tax codes, French language schooling, the conversion of Austrian law into the Napoleonic Code. Resistance fades, replaced by paperwork. Meanwhile, in Paris, the arts are gently co-opted into service. Jacques-Louis David, ever loyal, returns from Brussels with a sketchpad filled with triumphal visions. His new commission, Le Retour de l'Aigle, depicts Napoleon not in conquest, but in calm governance, surrounded by maps and ministers, his sword sheathed at his side. Theaters stage patriotic comedies. Pamphlets circulate, retelling Waterloo not as a moment of danger, but of destiny fulfilled. The Ministry of Public Morale, a quiet bureau buried within the Interior Ministry, ensures that dissent never quite finds traction. Even religion, so often a fault line in French history, is managed with soft hands. The Concordat of 1801 is reaffirmed, but a new clause ensures that all clergy must swear loyalty not only to the Pope, but to the Emperor as well. Jewish communities, particularly in Alsace, are granted expanded rights and exemptions from conscription. Protestant congregations in the South receive funding for new schools. Faith becomes not a battleground, but a channel through which loyalty flows. Outside France, the world watches cautiously. In London, Prime Minister Lord Liverpool delivers speeches about vigilance and naval readiness, but the House of Commons refuses funds for another war. The British economy, buoyed by trade, turns inward. In Vienna, Metternich fumes in private but sends only letters in public. Austria is too fractured to act. Russia, remote and philosophical, sends envoys bearing ambiguous overtures of continental equilibrium. And so, in the stillness that follows victory, France begins to reassert itself not as an empire of revolution, nor a republic of virtue, but as a system of order, a machine with brass gears and quiet engines humming beneath the surface of European life. The dream of permanence, once dismissed as hubris, now takes on the shape of policy. By the close of 1819, children born at the turn of the century begin to speak of the empire not as something dramatic or uncertain, but as something that simply is. The streets are clean, the laws are enforced, the roads are paved, the fields are taxed, and the post arrives on schedule. The thunder of drums has faded. In its place, the rhythm of governance, the quiet heartbeat of an empire newly reborn. The year is 1820, and the boulevards of Paris have settled into a rhythm both familiar and efficient. Dusty couriers still dash between ministries. Clerks shuffle parchment beneath the soft yellow glow of oil lamps. And across every district, the echo of uniformed cadence marks the passing of patrols. But beneath this surface of administrative regularity lies something subtler, the quiet expansion of imperial ambition, not through conquest, but through stability. In this decade, the Napoleonic regime does not seek to dominate through sheer force, but rather to become indispensable, to render itself so embedded in the daily experience of Europe that its absence would be unimaginable. France begins this decade not in military attire, but in the garments of diplomacy and civil management. In January of 1820, the emperor commissions a secret memorandum known only to his innermost circle, titled Mémoire sur l'harmonie européenne. In it, he outlines a vision for a Franco-centric but peaceful continental balance, a web of dependencies, alliances, and shared infrastructural projects that would render future conflict both costly and unpalatable. Canals connecting the Rhine and the Danube, joint educational academies in the borderlands, standardized tariffs across satellite states, and above all, French legal principles rooted in the Napoleonic Code, adopted in territories far beyond their origin. It begins quietly in Westphalia. Jérôme Bonaparte, ever the dutiful, if uninspired administrator, oversees the merging of local legal customs with the Code Civil. In classrooms and courtrooms alike, French becomes the language of law. In Stuttgart and Kassel, debates shift from the theological to the procedural. A generation of German jurists begins to cite Parisian precedents as if they were native. The empire, without annexing a single new province, spreads through the silent mechanisms of codification. Infrastructure becomes the new frontier of imperial expression. In 1822, the Ministry of Public Works unveils the Chemins Impériaux Initiative, an ambitious program to pave over 3,000 kilometers of roads, connect every departmental capital by high-speed courier routes, and begin surveying for steam railway corridors. Though true rail construction remains speculative, engineers like Marc Seguin and the elder Brunel are consulted, their blueprints quietly funded. Bridges are reinforced, postal routes are expanded. Time itself begins to bend around imperial schedules. It is no longer local churches or market bells that dictate the rhythm of the countryside, but Parisian time, delivered via timetable and tax record. Meanwhile, Napoleon's personal influence begins to withdraw from the spotlight, not out of infirmity, but by design. Having secured the foundations of the regime, he begins to elevate others, not family members whose prior failures linger in memory, but a cadre of talented administrators and scientists. Count Joseph Fouché, now older but still razor-minded, is recalled from retirement to advise on internal security. He does not run the Ministry of Police, but rather shapes its successors, civil policing commissions, urban sanitation boards, and municipal reporting systems that blend public order with public health. In the South, Prosper Mérimée, not yet the famed writer he would become, is commissioned to oversee regional heritage documentation. His cataloging of Roman ruins, Gothic churches, and early modern fortifications is less a cultural gesture than a quiet assertion of imperial guardianship over history itself. The state, now secure, turns its gaze backwards, to curate the past it once sought to overthrow. Restoration, once the domain of Bourbons, becomes a Bonapartist enterprise. The economic fabric of France, woven unevenly during the long years of war, now undergoes methodical repair. The Industrial Revolution, still nascent on the continent, begins to find footholds in the Rhone Valley and the coal-rich regions near Lille. State credit is extended cautiously to manufacturers experimenting with mechanized looms, and import tariffs are carefully restructured to encourage domestic innovation while avoiding British reprisals. A curious paradox emerges. France becomes protectionist not out of nationalism, but out of bureaucratic rhythm. The empire does not shout its intentions. It simply sets its policies and lets the world adjust. Yet not all corners of the empire move in quiet compliance. In Poland, where French influence has crept in through diplomatic and cultural channels, student uprisings and intellectual salons begin to question the boundaries of imperial benevolence. Paris responds not with troops, but with professors. The Sorbonne expands its scholarship programs to Krakow and Warsaw. French literature is translated and disseminated under state subsidy. The rebellion of minds is dulled not by punishment, but by inclusion. Over time, the Polish intelligentsia becomes fluent in Rousseau, Voltaire, and, curiously, Bonaparte himself. Where rebellion once brewed, graduate seminars now take root. Religion, too, continues to evolve in this quiet decade of power. The Concordat, though effective, is no longer sufficient for the growing administrative complexity of the empire. In 1824, a series of decrees established the Chambre des Cultes, a new department within the Ministry of the Interior tasked with monitoring and liaising with all recognized religious communities. Though nominally advisory, its power grows swiftly. Mosque construction in Algeria is recorded and regulated. Jewish community schools in Metz receive state-approved curricula. Protestant congregations submit pastoral appointments to Paris for vetting. It is the empire's final claim. Even the soul belongs in some measured way to the state. The arts flourish under this measured watch. The Opéra de Paris stages new works celebrating l'harmonie civique, grand performances extolling balance, duty, and quiet grandeur. Composers like Auber and Cherubini create music not of rousing triumph, but of elegant discipline. Painters submit works to state juries, their canvases reviewed not for provocation, but for alignment with imperial aesthetic principles. Romanticism is tolerated, but only when it celebrates motion within order. Wildness, if depicted, must always find resolution. In 1827, the emperor announces the Code Maritime, a sweeping effort to extend French naval law across the Mediterranean. Though the French Navy no longer seeks dominance on the high seas, its commercial fleets now demand clear regulation. Port cities like Marseille, Toulon, and Algiers are fitted with new customs regimes, new legal standards, and updated dry docks. The Mediterranean becomes a managed lake, less a theater of war than of audited commerce. Meanwhile, foreign observers continue to adapt to the imperial presence. In Britain, Parliament debates the implications of French bureaucratic efficiency. The Times runs editorials wondering aloud whether English governance can match the peculiar elegance of French administration. In Prussia, administrators adopt elements of the Napoleonic Code for use in their civil law. In Italy, local leaders increasingly mimic French models, sometimes uninvited, hoping to anticipate imperial favor. The empire no longer conquers. It compels through example, and through it all the emperor continues to recede, not into retirement, but into mythology. He appears in public less frequently, and when he does, it is always deliberate, opening a school, inspecting a canal, laying the first stone of a university hospital. Each gesture becomes ritual, the man becomes symbol, and in becoming symbol, he becomes eternal. By 1830, a generation has grown to adulthood under his unbroken rule. They have known no kings, no restorations, no coups, only order, only laws, only the slow, steady rhythm of a system that does not demand love but insists upon function. The empire, no longer described as Napoleonic, begins to be referred to simply as France, not a place, but a system, a set of expectations, and a method of life. Thus ends this decade of ascent, not with battles, not with revolutions, but with the steady entrenchment of imperial reality into the fabric of the everyday. The Morning Post, the standardized schoolbook, the paved road, the predictable tax, the opera ticket, the quiet nod to the bust of a man who no longer needs to rule actively, for the very air breathes his name. The year is 1831. A fine Parisian mist clings to the statues of Place Vendôme, now softly oxidized under the weight of 4 decades of imperial memory. The city is not in turmoil, nor is it at rest. Instead, it hums with the regularity of 1,000 bureaucratic pulses, ministries clicking, courts deliberating, workshops hammering iron against iron in rhythmic unity. Beneath this orchestrated din, however, arises a curious sensation, one that neither police reports nor parliamentary inquiries can fully articulate. The empire is secure, yet self-aware. It has become something more than a state. It is now a civilization unto itself. By this point, Napoleon no longer governs in the traditional sense. The imperial councils have taken on their own life, each ministry guided by a seasoned directorate, each prefecture nested in overlapping circuits of policy and tradition. The emperor's name appears regularly in decrees, of course, and his image continues to gaze serenely from busts in classrooms and theaters. But his physical presence grows rarer. He is often described in government bulletins as in consultation or in reflection, a gentle euphemism for a man more preoccupied with legacy than legislation. This quiet retreat is not a sign of weakness. Rather, it is the mark of a sovereign system that has begun to run on ritual and precedent. France no longer needs daily instruction from Napoleon. Instead, the imperial state has become self-perpetuating, its officials trained from youth in the rhythms of order, the aesthetics of clarity, the poetry of procedural exactness. They are not revolutionaries, nor even loyalists. They are imperial technicians, servants not of a man, but of a structure. As the decade unfolds, the empire's administrative tone shifts subtly from assertive to curatorial. Reforms continue, but they refine rather than invent. In 1833, the Révision Générale des Lois is launched, an encyclopedic project aimed at revisiting every legal decree issued since 1804, classifying, indexing, and cross-referencing them with judicial commentary. The goal is not simplification, but symmetry. The law must not only function, it must harmonize. Each clause becomes a note in a civil symphony, each code a movement in an ongoing composition of imperial order. Education, too, becomes a site of quiet transformation. The Écoles Centrales, established in the previous decade, are now expanded into a national network of lycéas impériaux. Admission is competitive, merit-based, and thoroughly bureaucratic. Students are instructed in mathematics, classical languages, jurisprudence, and applied sciences, with military instruction no longer compulsory but deeply ingrained. These are not merely schools. They are factories of imperial thought, shaping a generation for whom order, precision, and enlightened centralism are not dogmas, but habits. By 1835, these graduates begin to populate the middle tiers of government. Young, confident, and fluent in both Rousseau and Roman law, they enter the prefectures and ministries not as agitators, but as apostles of administrative elegance. Their memos are legible. Their records are clean. Their loyalties lie not with Bonaparte as a man, but with the Bonapartist system as an ideal. Yet, not all reflections are flattering. Across the provinces, especially in Brittany, the Pyrenees, and the far eastern regions of Alsace, local cultures begin to fray under the weight of standardization. Regional dialects diminish in print. Folk customs are quietly discouraged in favor of uniform civic rituals. Even architecture is subject to the new aesthetic of imperial proportion. Narrow village chapels are replaced by colonnaded municipal halls, their facades echoing the neoclassicism of Paris. Resistance is not overt. There are no barricades, no seditious pamphlets, only silence and the occasional sigh. A Breton child reciting declensions in a language foreign to his grandparents. A Provençal shopkeeper, recategorized as a petit industriel by tax officials who neither know nor care for the history of his trade. A quiet erosion, not of allegiance, but of identity. Beyond France's borders, the empire's neighbors find themselves increasingly drawn into its gravitational pull. The Confederation of the Rhine, long a nominal ally, begins to integrate more fully into the imperial economic system. In 1836, a unified customs agreement, l'Union Continentale, is signed by 22 territories, creating a shared tariff zone and mutual inspection protocols. Trains, still nascent, are allowed unfettered passage. Weights, measures, and schedules are harmonized. Austria, though outwardly aloof, quietly adopts many of these procedures through third-party intermediaries. Habsburg couriers carry French documents. Austrian legal journals reprint French case studies. It is a soft invasion, not of soldiers, but of standards. The empire, like water, seeps into every crevice not actively sealed. Britain, for its part, remains a skeptical observer. Its colonial reach continues to grow, and its navy still dominates the seas. But internally, Parliament finds itself increasingly pressed to match the apparent coherence of French governance. Reports from diplomats describe French rail surveys with admiration, French public health boards with envy, and French schooling with anxiety. The empire's success does not provoke fear, but rather discomfort. Its order casts a shadow over British inefficiency. In 1838, a new term emerges among British reformers, the Continental Mirror. It refers to the uneasy realization that while Britain projects power abroad, France has mastered the art of internal perfection. A government not louder but smoother, not freer, perhaps, but cleaner. The mirror reflects a challenge, not to arms, but to self-image. Back in France, cultural life continues its quiet bloom. A generation of poets, essayists, and painters grows up not under censorship, but under administrative expectation. The Ministry of Culture, now fully institutionalized, offers generous patronage, so long as certain narrative threads are maintained. The glory of civic duty, the melancholy of regulated ambition, the serenity of collective will. These themes become common. A genre of imperial pastoralism emerges, art that portrays the countryside not as wild and free, but as managed and serene. In the colonies, especially in Algeria and Senegal, imperial order becomes more assertive. Roads, schools, and courts are built with increasing speed. French civil servants rotate through assignments with mechanized regularity. Local leaders are absorbed into the bureaucratic ladder, sometimes given titles, often required to submit reports. The colonies do not rebel, not yet, but beneath the surface the tension simmers. Paris believes in the universality of its system. The colonies, however, remember their own. By 1840, a strange but palpable mood settles over the empire. It is a mixture of pride and fatigue, accomplishment and anticipation. The emperor, now 71, makes fewer appearances. When he does, crowds still cheer, but the volume is more reverent than raucous. He is no longer seen as a man of war, nor even of reform, but as the architect of permanence. His victories are not recounted with fervor, but with gratitude. He has delivered not glory, but regularity. And yet, in the quiet corners of salons and study groups, a question begins to form. If the system is so complete, so harmonized, so efficient, what remains for the next generation to do? Is their destiny merely to manage, to maintain? Is the highest expression of political life now reduced to refinement? This chapter closes, then, not with a flourish, but with a meditation. The empire, in its fourth decade, stands not at a precipice, but on a plateau. From here, the view is vast. The landscape is organized. The skies are calm. But, in the far distance, barely perceptible yet undeniable, clouds of restlessness begin to stir. By the spring of 1841, the rhythm of empire remains intact, but the tempo begins to feel rehearsed. In Paris, the boulevards are still swept with mechanical precision. The trams run on time. Couriers in tailored uniforms carry memoranda from one ministry to another, their leather satchels polished, their boots spotless. But behind the windows of salons and libraries, conversations take on a more questioning tone. The empire is still functioning, exquisitely so, but its spirit has become introspective. One cannot trace this change to a single moment, yet one might linger on the winter of 1841 when news circulates that the emperor has declined a ceremonial review of troops due to delicate health. Though officially dismissed as trivial, the announcement travels through the arteries of France with uncanny resonance. It is the first public acknowledgement that Napoleon, le vieux lion, as some have begun to call him, is mortal. And with that, the illusion of timelessness begins, ever so softly, to dissolve. The emperor, now entering his 72nd year, spends his days at the Château de Rambouillet. The palace, once a hunting retreat, has transformed into an imperial cloister of sorts, its vast gardens trimmed not for aesthetic splendor, but for contemplative walks. Advisors come and go, though rarely with urgency. Files arrive daily, but fewer bear his marginalia in the thick, assertive hand of his youth. He has become a custodian of his own legacy, listening more than commanding, revising more than inventing. Within the corridors of governance, the atmosphere shifts correspondingly. Ministries begin to operate in cautious autonomy. Ministers defer more frequently to precedent than vision, interpreting rather than innovating. The imperial bureaucracy, so carefully engineered for efficiency, now functions like an automaton, precise, tireless, but increasingly impersonal. Local prefectures echo the mood, issuing circulars filled with assurances of stability, yet thinly veiled in an undercurrent of stasis. In the provinces, this mood translates into a quiet stillness. The grand canalization projects of the 1830s are now complete. New infrastructure slows to a trickle. Villages that had braced for transformation now find themselves simply waiting. For what, they cannot say. Peasants in Auvergne speak of a government that governs from far away, not in cruelty, but in absence. In the Pyrenees, schoolmasters teach from books with frayed covers, still quoting imperial precepts, but with less conviction. It is not discontent that brews, but a kind of soft detachment. More visible, however, is the burgeoning restlessness among the urban intellectuals. The generation of thinkers educated in the empire's idealized system now finds itself yearning not for order, but for nuance. Journals begin to publish essays examining the limits of imperial rationality. Writers question whether beauty must always be symmetrical, whether governance must always be centralized, whether history must always culminate in victory. In 1843, a controversial essay appears in La Revue Civique, entitled The Paralysis of Perfection. The author, known only as L.G., argues that the empire has created not a society, but a machine, admirable, precise, but devoid of spontaneity. The essay spreads quietly but quickly. By spring, it is being discussed in faculty lounges from Lyon to Strasbourg and even whispered about in ministerial antechambers. The imperial government responds not with censorship, but with silence. The essay is neither condemned nor endorsed. But behind the scenes, a new initiative is launched. Le Dialogue Impérial, a national series of forums meant to restore civic engagement and intellectual dynamism. Though noble in aim, the execution is predictably procedural. Forums are held in municipal theaters with printed agendas and designated speakers. Audience questions are reviewed in advance. The dialogues do not spark debate, they reaffirm protocol. Meanwhile, a different kind of dialogue brews across the Mediterranean. In Algeria, the imperial presence grows increasingly assertive. In 1844, the Office for Colonial Integration releases a 700-page report entitled The Harmonization of Civic Cultures, advocating for the accelerated Frenchification of Algerian legal, linguistic, and educational institutions. The report is methodical, thorough, and in its own way culturally tone-deaf. The response from the local population is one of quiet disobedience. In villages across the Tel Atlas, school attendance dwindles. Legal petitions are delayed. Mosques resume older rhythms of instruction. The empire, for all its brilliance, begins to misunderstand the complexity of its peripheries. It applies symmetry where dialogue is needed, structure where empathy might have sufficed. Back in Europe, economic signs also begin to falter. A poor harvest in 1846 leads to food price surges in the northern departments. Though the imperial food reserves buffer the worst effects, the episode exposes the fragility beneath the smooth facade. Rumors emerge of prefects falsifying supply reports, of grain merchants hoarding despite regulations. These whispers do not erupt into rebellion, but they puncture the myth of infallibility. In 1847, the Ministry of Internal Affairs commissions a full audit of regional governance, hoping to assess the health of the imperial body. The resulting rapport sur l'harmonie administrative is, on the surface, glowing. Yet the appendix, circulated only among top officials, contains more sobering observations: declining civic participation, rising absenteeism in local councils, and a noticeable drop in the number of graduates entering civil service. That same year, an unprecedented literary work is published, Mémoire d'un fonctionnaire silencieux, a fictionalized account of an anonymous bureaucrat drifting through the administrative labyrinth. The work is melancholy, filled with reverent boredom and subtle irony. It becomes an unexpected success, particularly among young readers. Its popularity suggests a generational fatigue, not with the empire's achievements, but with its emotional climate. By 1848, the imperial court grows ever more insulated. Napoleon himself ceases public appearances altogether. His days are consumed by reading, correspondence, and short walks in the western gardens of Rambouillet. Portraits depict him seated, thoughtful, his uniform immaculate, but his posture less martial than philosophical. He has become a symbol not of conquest, but of completion. That year, a quiet political movement begins in Paris, Le Cercle de l'Horizon, composed of young academics, junior civil servants, and even a few military officers. The group meets discreetly to discuss a new vision, one that honors the empire's legacy, but imagines a more participatory, pluralistic future. They do not call for revolt. They do not scorn the emperor. Instead, they pose a singular radical question. What comes after perfection? It is this question, not a scandal nor a battle, that marks the true crack beneath the marble. The imperial system has not failed. It has, in many ways, succeeded too thoroughly. But in doing so, it has exhausted the emotional resonance of governance. The empire, in all its splendor, now finds itself yearning not for correction, but for inspiration. As the decade draws to a close, the atmosphere is one of deep calm, tinged with premonition. The structures still stand, the laws still function, the people still obey. But somewhere, in the distance, a breeze begins to stir among the poplars of Rambouillet. The leaves rustle, not in alarm, but in anticipation. In the winter of 1851, a peculiar silence descends upon the Château de Rambouillet. The snowfall is unusually heavy that January, muffling every hoofbeat and carriage wheel, draping the forest in a veil of hush. Within the palace walls, the emperor lies in a chamber warmed by 2 fireplaces, each carefully tended by footmen trained not to disturb the stillness. The air is thick with the perfume of cedar oil and the muted presence of waiting. Napoleon Bonaparte, now in his 82nd year, has become a relic of his own legend. His face, once sharp with ambition and fire, is now gentle, the lines of age drawn not with pain, but with an almost painterly care. His eyes still carry that imperial clarity, but they are often closed in contemplation, as though seeing into a realm only he can access, a library of remembered campaigns, maps, dialogues, and decisions. He does not speak often. When he does, it is in precise, measured sentences, as if words themselves now cost something precious. Doctors arrive each morning. They do not declare anything. They murmur. They examine charts. They discuss circulation, appetite, pulse. But the truth has already permeated the palace like moisture in the stone. The emperor is dying. Not quickly, not violently, but in that long, inevitable way that time itself imposes on even the greatest of men. The empire does not panic. The system he built has been prepared for this moment for years. Committees convene daily in Paris. Ministers attend to the machinery. Public notices are carefully worded. No mention of illness is made. The people are told the emperor is at repose, reflecting on the future. But in drawing rooms and marketplaces, the citizens whisper, not in fear, not in anger, but with a softness like the folding of a flag. In February, his son, Jean-Napoleon Bonaparte, Duke of Lyon and imperial heir, arrives from Brussels. He is 52, reserved, polite, with a manner more diplomatic than martial. Unlike his father, he has never been a soldier. He has studied law and literature. He has administered provinces with precision and fairness. But his name inspires deference, not awe. He visits the emperor daily, often reading aloud from memoirs or dispatches, pausing when the old man nods, continuing when he closes his eyes. On the 14th of March, 1851, at precisely 6:32 in the evening, with the window shutters drawn and the room bathed in amber lamplight, the emperor passes. No final words. No dramatic gesture. His breath simply ceases, and with it, a century's tempo falters. The attending physician, Dr. Claude Verrier, notes the moment in a small, leather-bound journal. He does not speak. He bows and leaves the room. The death is not announced for 24 hours. The cabinet meets in emergency conclave at the Palais d'Orsay. By candlelight, they approve the succession protocol, review the funeral arrangements, and activate the transition directives, documents long prepared, revised yearly, outlining in excruciating detail the next 30 days. The Prime Minister, Etienne Freville, issues a national address on the evening of the 15th. His voice is steady, his diction exact. The emperor has rejoined the timeless firmament of our civilization. Let his deeds guide our tomorrows. Across the empire, church bells toll. For 72 hours, all commerce is suspended. Flags are drawn in sable. Theaters go dark. Public assemblies are canceled. In schools, pupils are instructed to write a letter to the emperor, not as tribute, but as an act of reflection. Thousands of letters pour into the postal centers, many addressed simply as "To the Emperor among the Stars." The funeral is scheduled for the 25th of March. It is an affair of immaculate choreography. Delegations arrive from every corner of the empire, from Lombardy, Carthage, Hispania, Prague, and Alexandria. Uniforms gleam, orchestras rehearse in crypts beneath the basilicas. The procession is designed to move not as a column of grief, but as a river of remembrance, slow, deep, inexorable. The route begins at the Église du Dôme, crosses the Seine via a bridge built in the emperor's honor, and winds through the central boulevards, where every building has been draped in deep gray silk. At exactly 10 a.m., the funeral carriage, a vast glass-paneled structure with bronze eagles at each corner, emerges from the gates of the Hôtel des Invalides. The crowd is silent. No one chants, no one cries. They simply watch, still as statuary, their breath-forming little clouds in the spring air. Among the crowd, older men remove their hats. Some kneel. Children peer from behind their mothers' skirts. A woman in Lyon faints. In Marseille, fishermen do not set out to sea that day. In Oran, students march in white garments reciting passages from the emperor's early speeches. In Cairo, the university halts lectures for a week. It is not a state funeral, it is a planetary pause. The body is interred in a mausoleum beneath the Arc Celeste, a structure commissioned decades earlier, but only now completed. The architecture is a hybrid of Roman grandeur and Enlightenment symmetry, designed not to exalt a man, but to sanctify an era. The interior dome is etched with every campaign he led, every law he passed, every treaty he signed. The tomb itself is a single block of black granite, uninscribed save for a golden laurel wreath, eternally lit from above by a beam of filtered sunlight. The days that follow are quiet, not heavy with mourning, but adrift in introspection. Ministries function, markets resume, railways operate, but everything is done with a softness, as if the world were newly fragile. Jean-Napoleon is sworn in as emperor on the 2nd of April, in a modest ceremony attended only by key government figures and provincial delegates. He refuses the title Napoleon II, opting instead for Jean-Napoleon Vermont. He speaks little. His oath is brief. His first decree is a continuation. The principles of harmony, order, and universal governance shall endure. But behind the seams begin to strain. He lacks his father's gravitational authority. Meetings run longer. Advisors speak more freely. Debates emerge not about policy, but about interpretation. What would the emperor have wanted? What did he mean in 1836? How should his legacy be applied in Algeria, in Poland, in Anatolia? For the first time in decades, uncertainty enters the bloodstream of governance, not violently, but pervasively. In private journals, civil servants record feelings of displacement. "We are custodians of a legend," writes one regional prefect in Toulouse, but legends are poor guides for the living. The empire continues, but it no longer emanates direction. It maintains, it manages, it remembers. Yet the people, curiously, remain loyal, not to the new emperor, but to the memory of the old. Statues become shrines. His writings are republished in countless editions. A new holiday is instituted, Journée du Législateur, observed every year on March 14th. On that day, every student reads from the Napoleonic Code. Every town hall reaffirms its foundational precepts. And in every corner of the empire, for a single hour, time seems to pause once more. As 1855 approaches, the world beyond the empire stirs. The Ottoman territories shift in policy. The Prussian Confederation adopts a more militarized posture. Trade networks in the Americas begin to evolve at a pace that demands diplomatic recalibration. But the empire, for now, does not pivot. It holds, it steadies itself, it watches. In the quiet glow of dusk, in the great cities and quiet villages alike, one senses a strange tranquility. Not resignation, not decline, but a kind of waiting, like a breath held just before the next sentence. And so the emperor rests. And so the empire breathes, measured and even, drifting gently toward a future that has not yet found its voice. The accession of Jean-Napoleon I in the spring of 1855 did not bring with it the pageantry or fervor that had accompanied his father's reign. There was no resounding proclamation to conquer time, no fiery declarations of the imperial will, no theatrical military parades rumbling down the wide boulevards of Paris. Instead, there was an almost ecclesiastical restraint, a careful modulation of tone and tempo. The empire, so long forged in the crucible of action, now settled into something more contemplative, what historians would later term la période tranquille, the quiet period. At 45 years of age, Jean-Napoleon appeared every inch the statesman, silver at his temples, a trimmed beard that gave his face a sense of mature gravitas, and eyes that surveyed with curiosity rather than command. He had not campaigned in the field. He had never addressed a regiment in battle. He had spent his adult life not among soldiers, but among scholars, lawyers, and the slow-ticking bureaucracies of provincial administration. His ascent was not a moment of dramatic rupture, but of dutiful continuity. And perhaps that was precisely what the empire needed. His first acts in office were not bold decrees or systemic overhauls, but careful refinements, adjustments in policy language, reassignment of key ministerial roles, and the issuance of the instructional letters, a series of handwritten memoranda dispatched to each of the empire's 83 prefects. Each letter was tailored to the specific needs and histories of the region it addressed. In Toulouse, the prefect was encouraged to foster agricultural cooperatives. In Vienna, urban renewal projects were to be reevaluated through the lens of historical congruence. In Alexandria, Jean-Napoleon asked that public education initiatives incorporate elements of Coptic and Islamic scholarship alike. The imperial court followed suit. The opulence of the Tuileries was gently dimmed. Court dress became more subdued. Public ceremonies, once flamboyant exhibitions of imperial grandeur, were pared back into dignified but modest affairs. The emperor did not attend the theater, nor host lavish balls. Instead, he invited mathematicians, urban planners, and linguists to quiet dinners in candlelit salons. Guests would speak in turns, carefully, as Jean-Napoleon listened with an attentiveness so absolute it seemed monastic. The Napoleonic Code, long considered the cornerstone of civil order, was revised, minimally but meaningfully. Provisions relating to inheritance law were softened, enabling greater rights for women in property management. Municipal charters were standardized across the empire's vast geography, reducing legal confusion in frontier regions like Dalmatia and the interior of Al-Andalus. A new set of judicial circuits was established, known collectively as the Courts of Harmonization, whose function was not to adjudicate disputes per se, but to ensure that local legal traditions remained in balance with the imperial constitution. It was not exciting, it did not stir the blood, but it worked. Indeed, across the empire, stability deepened. Grain production in Hispania increased by 14% between 1857 and 1862, thanks to Jean-Napoleon's rural irrigation initiatives. Literacy rates climbed markedly in Anatolia, where the dual-language schooling reforms bore fruit more swiftly than expected. In the Moroccan territories, trade through the port of Agadir was facilitated by a customs reform that reduced levies on intra-imperial merchants, a small change with outsized economic effects. The imperial treasury, long devoted to military expenditure, now turned inward, subsidizing libraries, observatories, postal infrastructure, and botanical expeditions. Diplomatically, Jean-Napoleon was a master of what might be termed imperial whispering. He did not declare intentions, but hinted them. He did not forge grand alliances, but cultivated careful dependencies. In 1859, a quiet treaty was signed with the Kingdom of Sweden, wherein agricultural exchange and naval docking privileges were extended mutually, all without fanfare. In 1861, the emperor met privately with Persian delegates in Lyon, not at court, but at a converted abbey, discussing border stability and cultural scholarship. The press received only the vaguest notion of these meetings. Rumor became the currency of diplomacy. Perhaps the most emblematic symbol of Jean-Napoleon's rule was the Palais des Archives, inaugurated in 1863 on the banks of the Seine. This was no military headquarters, no executive residence, but a vast library-museum-archive hybrid, designed not to glorify war or conquest, but to catalog the empire's evolution. Every edict, every speech, every budgetary report since the dawn of Napoleonic governance was collected there. Citizens could request to view these records, and many did. School groups wandered its corridors. Retired generals visited to reread their own dispatches from decades past. It was a cathedral of memory, humming softly beneath stained glass and skylights. Yet, for all its orderliness, all its calm progress, there emerged slowly the sense of something unspoken. Not discontent exactly, nor rebellion, but a quiet wondering. In cafes and correspondence, in university seminars and editorial columns, questions began to surface. Was this still an empire of dreams, or had it become merely an empire of maintenance? What was the meaning of conquest, if not in territory, then in spirit? What were the people to believe in? Jean-Napoleon answered these not with proclamations, but with philosophy. In 1864, he published Essai sur la souveraineté harmonieuse, a slim volume that combined Enlightenment reasoning with gentle mysticism. In it, he argued that governance should emulate music, each province a note, each policy a tone, all resonating in polyphonic balance. The metaphor resonated deeply with some. Others found it abstract, even indulgent, but none could deny its sincerity. Still, the edges of the empire began to fidget. In the Balkans, national identities stirred anew. Intellectual societies in Prague discussed autonomy in academic language, but with political undertones. In Egypt, merchant guilds quietly began to question their obligations to Paris. And in South America, where the empire had only modest commercial outposts, the ascendant states of Brazil and the Argentine Confederation signaled a new geopolitical tempo, one less inclined to defer to European precedent. The emperor responded not with force, but with forms. In 1865, he convened the Congress of Civic Coherence, inviting delegates from every imperial region to Paris. The goal was not reform nor affirmation, but dialogue. They met in repurposed train stations and botanical gardens, not palaces. They debated languages, currencies, border policies, and the philosophical nature of unity. No concrete laws emerged, but a kind of collective breath was taken. And yet, something in the atmosphere had changed. It was subtle. A shade of restlessness in the students at Montpellier, a whisper of satire in the playhouses of Genoa, a hesitation in the correspondence of colonial governors. The empire still stood. It functioned impeccably. But its heart, though not empty, beat more slowly, as if awaiting something unnamed. Jean Napoleon felt this too. He wrote in his private journal in December of 1865, "Perhaps I govern as one governs a museum, dusting, preserving, admiring, but not building. My father built. I sustain. But will the world allow itself to be sustained?" The quiet was no longer simply peace. It had become stillness. And in that stillness, seeds stirred beneath the surface, unseen, unspoken, but present. By the year 1866, the Napoleonic Empire was more geographically expansive and administratively stable than ever before. From the rugged Scottish Highlands, still held as a protectorate under French oversight, to the sun-baked hills of Tunis, from the forested edges of Galicia to the citrus groves of Levantine Syria, the imperial eagle hovered over peoples, languages, and traditions as varied as the colors of the Mediterranean sky. But in this very breadth, this very triumph of order and governance, lay the conditions for its quiet unraveling. It began, as such movements often do, not in the halls of power, but in the seminar rooms of universities and the corners of cafes. In Prague, the House of Slavic Studies, a small ivy-covered annex of the Imperial Academy, held lectures not only in French, but increasingly in Czech. The students there were fluent in Voltaire and Descartes, of course, but they also recited the ballads of Karel Hynek Mácha and debated the concept of Národ, the nation, as distinct from the empire. These were not calls for uprising, but for recognition, for language, for dignity within multiplicity. Similarly, in the port city of Alexandria, once a vibrant node of trade and imperial administration, the merchant guilds began to convene in private. These were men of ledgers and shipments, of spice and grain and maritime insurance. They did not speak of revolution. They spoke of taxation, of whether tariffs set in Paris truly served the fluctuating currents of Mediterranean commerce, whether Cairo and Beirut and Algiers might benefit from a customs union of their own, defined not by loyalty to a distant throne, but by the pulse of the sea itself. In South America, meanwhile, the French presence had long been minimal, strategic outposts in Guyana and a thin economic relationship with the southern republics. But by 1868, the geopolitical weather began to shift. Brazil, recently unified under the House of Braganza, launched a series of industrialization projects, quietly backed by British financiers. The Argentine Confederation expanded its railways. And in this confluence of movement and trade, the French consulates reported a cooling of sentiment. Imperial flags, once displayed in ceremonial rooms, were now stored discreetly. French newspapers went unread in libraries. The very notion of Europe as the center of progress began to fade in the southern sun. Back in the Balkans, a region long under close imperial supervision, the poetry changed first. In Belgrade, the literary magazine Nova Svitanja published verses that described the Danube not as a conduit of commerce, but as a mother river, ancient and sovereign. These were poems, not manifestos. But when read aloud in cafes, they drew silent, solemn nods. A generation of Serbs, Croats, and Bulgarians had grown up within the imperial school system, had memorized Napoleonic dates and laws, and yet they now wrote plays and songs that yearned for something older, more local, less universal. Jean Napoleon, still on the throne, perceived this shift with the same melancholy precision that had characterized his rule. He did not send troops. He dispatched pamphlets, essays on unity, letters reminding citizens of shared civic ideals. In 1870, he launched the Imperial Fellowship Grant, offering funding for young scholars to study in Paris, regardless of province. He envisioned a web of intellect and goodwill that would bind the empire tighter than chains or muskets ever could. For a time, it worked. The libraries filled, the trains ran. The theaters performed Molière and Corneille in half a dozen tongues, but the identity of the periphery had begun to sediment. In Krakow, city officials petitioned to reintroduce municipal signage in Polish. In Corsica, newspapers began printing dual language columns. In Tunis, legal students requested that court proceedings be translated into Arabic alongside French. These were not refusals of empire, but assertions of selfhood within it. And therein lay the complexity. Jean Napoleon's administration could not easily declare such acts seditious, for they were framed in the language of participation, not separation. Yet the center grew weary. Within the ministries of Paris, especially the Department of Internal Integration, murmurs turned to warnings. A series of memoranda, dry, precise, dated in careful red ink, began to accumulate. One noted the decline in applications from frontier provinces to central administrative schools. Another documented a statistical shift. Fewer graduates from Breton institutions were accepting posts in Lyon or Dijon. Still another recorded that certain imperial rituals, such as the Day of Concord, were receiving diminished attendance outside the French-speaking corps. This drift was not merely cultural. Economic patterns followed suit. The Merchant Alliance of the Levant, unofficial, unproclaimed, quietly established its own set of trade conventions in 1872, with weights and measures calibrated to local traditions rather than imperial standards. The imperial treasury did not block the development as revenues continued to flow, but the precedent was noted. Autonomy, once a theoretical concern, was now practiced in the rhythms of daily life. Still, no province declared secession, no soldiers defected, no flags were torn down. The empire held, it breathed, it adjusted. Yet even within the imperial core, new conversations were emerging. Parisian salons began to debate the merits of decentralization, not as rebellion, but as reform. Could a republic be nested within an empire? Could local parliaments, governed by imperial framework, offer a solution to the mounting dissonance? Writers like Louise Carrière and Auguste Morin published essays that flirted with federalist ideas, invoking the model of the Holy Roman Empire, or even the Swiss cantons. They were not agitators. They were historians with typewriters. And still, Jean Napoleon listened, but his responses grew slower, his journal entries more contemplative. In one dated June 1873, he wrote, "My father ruled with maps. I must rule with mirrors. The empire reflects itself now, fragmented, yes, but not yet broken." In the mountain valleys of Savoy, farmers began forming local cooperatives that bypassed imperial grain quotas. In Bordeaux, vintners sought direct trade contracts with Bavaria. In Damascus, scholars began translating imperial statutes into classical Arabic, not for resistance, but for clarity, for ownership, for understanding. It was not rebellion, it was not submission, it was the empire learning to whisper back. And so, as 1875 approached, the great Napoleonic monolith remained intact. No borders had shifted, no capital had fallen, but a slow decentralization of identity was well underway. The peripheries were no longer merely governed, they were dreaming, planning, reimagining, not in defiance, but in a quiet, emerging autonomy. And in this tension, this fragile coexistence between unity and difference, lay the prelude to transformation. In the spring of 1876, a conference was convened at Lyon, a city that had once been a Gallic stronghold, then a Roman outpost, then a medieval trade hub, and now, in this alternate current of time, a neutral site for imperial deliberation. It was not billed as a constitutional congress, though that is what many hoped it would become. Officially, it was the Colloquium on Regional Integration, a name carefully chosen by the Department of Cultural Affairs to soothe the sensibilities of the conservative ministries. But for those who attended, its implications were clear. The Napoleonic Empire, now entering its 7th decade of uninterrupted dominion, was contemplating reinvention. The catalyst was not rebellion, as one might expect. It was not economic collapse, nor foreign invasion. It was memory, faint, persistent, inescapable memory. The peripheries had spoken in poems and shipping contracts and legal petitions, and now the center responded with structure. At the heart of these discussions lay the principle of fédéralisme harmonisé, harmonized federalism, a phrase coined by political philosopher Émile Benoît Lavigne, whose 1874 treatise, The Breath of the Eagle, proposed a model wherein regional identities would be granted administrative autonomy while remaining tethered to a strong, centralized imperial government. Lavigne argued that unity could no longer depend upon cultural uniformity or military enforcement. Rather, it must be sustained through shared institutions, mutual recognition, and a sophisticated network of interdependent parliaments. Jean Napoleon, now in the twilight of his reign, was both cautious and curious. His health had begun to wane, his speeches shorter, his hand shakier. But his mind remained sharp. He authorized the Lyon Colloquium with a single sentence. Let the empire consider its own echo. And so, representatives from every administrative region, 49 in total, arrived with folders, manuscripts, and 1,000 competing visions of what a future empire might resemble. The proceedings were slow. Each day began with an address in French, followed by consecutive translations in Breton, Polish, Arabic, Occitan, and Czech. A speaker from Dubrovnik demanded the reinstatement of local legislative councils, citing ancient Ragusan traditions. A Corsican delegate presented a draft charter proposing bilingual education for all island schools. The Bavarian envoy, though technically representing a client state rather than an integrated province, delivered a stirring address on the necessity of co-legislation in matters of cross-border infrastructure. And then there were the conservatives. Representatives from Paris, Dijon, and Reims viewed the entire endeavor with suspicion. For them, the empire was not broken. It required no constitutional scaffolding, no risky decentralization. They feared that local parliaments would become nests of discontent, that the sacred clarity of French civil law might be muddied by a mosaic of regional statutes. They reminded the Assembly, gently but firmly, that it had been unity, rigorous, luminous, unflinching, that had protected the empire from the fractious fate of the Habsburgs or the Ottomans. Yet the tide was turning, not with shouts, but with sighs. A compromise emerged. The concept of regional consultative councils, non-binding legislative bodies, permitted to draft policy recommendations in domains of culture, education, and infrastructure. These councils would be elected locally, but overseen by a prefect appointed by the Imperial Senate. Their resolutions would be reviewed annually in a General Assembly at Tours. In 1878, the first of these councils was inaugurated in Krakow. The opening ceremony was modest, a single brass band, speeches in French and Polish, a ribbon cut by the imperial commissioner, but its existence reverberated. Within a year, similar councils had formed in Thessaloniki, Palermo, and Aleppo. Their impact was, at first, minimal, but the symbolism was unmistakable. The empire had begun to codify plurality. The economic dimensions of this transformation unfolded in parallel. The Ministry of Commerce, under the stewardship of Delphine Artaud, a quietly effective administrator known for her encyclopedic memory of tariff schedules, introduced a series of reforms in 1880 under the umbrella of the Pan-Imperial Trade Accord. This initiative allowed for provinces with consultative councils to propose adjustments to local trade laws, subject to imperial approval. The result was a flurry of regional experimentation: tax incentives for agricultural cooperatives in Occitania, subsidies for textile workshops in the Balkans, maritime insurance schemes in the Maghreb. Each experiment was logged, analyzed, and debated in the pages of Le Moniteur Impérial, which had by now introduced multilingual editions. Across cafes and academic halls, the people of the empire began to feel that their voices, however mediated, had entered the bloodstream of governance. Yet all was not seamless. The military establishment, always wary of change, balked at proposals to include regional dialects in officer training. General Armand Camille Doucet of the imperial staff famously quipped, "An army that fights in 20 tongues will not know when to charge." His concerns were echoed by colonial administrators, particularly in the Levant, who feared that local councils might encourage nationalist sentiment among Arab populations. The balance between participation and fragmentation was delicately poised upon the whims of bureaucrats, scholars, and aging statesmen. In 1883, Jean Napoleon summoned a conclave of senior advisors to his summer estate in Fontainebleau. There, beneath the tall trees and echoing halls of that ancient palace, he posed a question whose answer would define the next chapter of the empire's existence. Can we be many and still be one? The response was not immediate, but one advisor, the historian Élodie Mercier, spoke of rivers, that they could branch into countless streams and yet remain part of a single watershed. Her words were recorded, discussed, and eventually printed beneath the title of a new imperial edict, the Fontainebleau Decree on Plurality in Unity, issued on the 1st of May, 1884. This decree formally recognized regional consultative councils as permanent fixtures of the empire's political architecture. It outlined protocols for legislative feedback, mandated annual translations of imperial law into 6 languages, and allocated budgetary discretion to regional treasuries within tightly controlled limits. To the imperial loyalist, this was a bold yet reasonable extension of civic inclusion. To the provincial intellectual, it was a cautious opening, a signal that true federalism might yet be born. And to those watching from beyond the empire's borders, be they Prussian chancellors or British parliamentarians, it was a fascinating, perhaps unsettling experiment. An empire that sought to modernize not by conquering new lands, but by accommodating old ones. By the end of 1885, the empire of Napoleon remained intact, its borders unchanged, its cities orderly. But something ineffable had shifted. A new layer had been added to the palimpsest of governance, transparent enough not to alarm, substantial enough to matter. And so the empire stood, not trembling, but tilting, subtly, toward a future it could not yet name. The winter of 1886 arrived earlier than usual in Prague. Snow clung to copper roofs and blanketed the wide boulevards built during the Second Imperial Modernization. Beneath the frost, however, something intangible stirred. In cafes, university lecture halls, and church courtyards, discussion took on a new tone, less speculative, more urgent. Students, poets, clerics, and merchants had begun to feel the slow accumulation of administrative fatigue. The regional consultative councils, once heralded as beacons of inclusion, now seemed burdened by their own limitations. Petitions traveled to Tours and were returned with stamps but little substance. Resolutions were passed and filed, debated, but rarely enacted. What had begun as a quiet flowering of regional identity was now, in many quarters, beginning to wilt under the weight of procedural inertia. In Thessaloniki, the city's council had submitted 8 consecutive proposals for the recognition of Judeo-Spanish as a language of instruction in local schools. Each one had been noted, but never implemented. In Aleppo, civic leaders had requested modest jurisdiction over irrigation policy, a matter essential to the livelihoods of thousands, only to receive a reply 3 years later that the matter fell beyond regional competence. It was not oppression, it was not violence. It was, in the words of one Armenian councilman, the tyranny of waiting. And yet, in Paris, the perception was otherwise. The Ministry of the Interior, now headed by François-Émile Verviers, viewed these murmurs as dangerous deviations from the imperial ideal. Verviers, a man known for his ascetic lifestyle and unshakable faith in centralized bureaucracy, initiated a quiet but deliberate rollback of consultative autonomy. Budgets were restructured, requiring prior approval not only from provincial prefects, but from metropolitan accountants. Council charters were revised to prohibit formal contact with foreign diplomatic missions. Most significantly, new regulations required all council correspondence to be submitted in French only, citing efficiency as justification. The response was not immediate rebellion, but a withdrawal of confidence. Attendance at council meetings began to decline. Committees dissolved for want of quorum. In Krakow, the minutes of the May 1888 Assembly record a poignant note. Members expressed doubt that speech is still an instrument of influence. Yet despite this quiet disillusionment, the empire's infrastructure continued to hum. Trains arrived on time, postal routes expanded. The Imperial Telegraph Service introduced a unified encryption protocol that enhanced security across 4 time zones. On the surface, the empire was thriving, but dissent rarely begins with drama. It begins, rather, with repetition of ignored grievances, of rhetorical gestures, of words spoken into the wind. In 1889, Élodie Mercier, now retired from public service but still regarded as a moral conscience of the regime, published a pamphlet titled The Sound of Fracture. It described the empire not as a collapsing edifice, but as a frozen lake, one whose surface appears pristine while cracks form invisibly below. Her prose was delicate, poetic, unmistakably foreboding. The pamphlet was banned in Marseille and Lyon, but circulated widely in Vilnius, Naples, and Algiers. It became required reading in several universities, sparking discussion groups that were neither revolutionary nor entirely loyal. They occupied a liminal space, neither inside nor outside the imperial narrative, where dissent could be contemplated but not yet declared. In 1890, a quieter moment with profound implications unfolded in the provincial town of Brno. There, the council president, Tomáš Vavrinek, delivered a speech to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the regional assembly. His speech, delivered in Czech and then repeated in French, included a line that would echo far beyond the modest amphitheater in which it was spoken. If the empire will not learn new languages, it will forget its own. Nietzscheist, the phrase, translated into Polish, Arabic, and Occitan within weeks, became a discreet slogan, written in chalk on university walls and whispered in student gatherings across the provinces. Meanwhile, Jean Napoleon's successor, Auguste Napoleon, had ascended the throne following his father's quiet death in 1891. Where the elder had governed with serene patience, the younger approached power with an air of restless modernity. A product of the Imperial Military Academy and a frequent contributor to the Revue d'État, Auguste was known for his interest in electrical engineering and urban planning, but he lacked his father's instinct for ambiguity, for letting silence stretch just long enough to avoid a definitive answer. Augustus sought clarity, and clarity, within an empire of polyglot councils and half-binding resolutions, proved elusive. In 1892, he issued the Edict on Uniform Administrative Standards, a sweeping regulation intended to streamline bureaucratic procedures across the empire. The edict required all educational institutions to adopt a unified curriculum, centralized procurement for all regional governments, and an imperial licensing system for printers. While lauded by industrialists and some urban technocrats, it was met with profound unease in the provinces. Schools that had begun to incorporate dual language instruction were forced to abandon local texts. Printers in Alexandria and Ljubljana struggled to obtain permits. Even minor local publications, recipes, farming bulletins, weather almanacs, now required approval from Parisian censors. As the decade drew to a close, dissent moved from the margins into formal politics. In Palermo, a new party emerged, the Partito per l'Equilibrio Regionale, calling for the full legislative independence of regional councils. In Bohemia, the Komise Lidové Správy began publishing alternative budgets that imagined a world in which tax revenues remained within the province. In Algiers, a series of open letters by the writer Samira Belhaj critiqued the empire's hydraulic colonialism, its tendency to centralize natural resource control without regard to local conditions. And yet, the center held, not through violence or repression, but through sheer momentum. The imperial army remained loyal, the railways efficient, the bureaucracy responsive, at least within its own terms. But the mood had changed. The empire had not fractured. Not yet. But one could now feel, in the pauses between speeches and the delays between proposals and responses, the presence of something new, expectation that the promises of federalism might become real, that plurality might mean more than polite footnotes in imperial decrees, that the empire, having acknowledged diversity, might one day grant it the dignity of decision. By the end of 1895, the Lake of Unity still reflected the imperial sky. But the cracks beneath, silent, spreading, real, waited patiently. Spring arrived late to Ljubljana in 1896, the Danube swollen with meltwater from the Alps, and the streets still muddy from lingering snows. In the town square, the annual commemoration of the imperial constitution was attended by fewer than 36 people, half of them civil servants. The council banner, once proudly unfurled from the Rathaus balcony, remained folded in its cabinet. The sense of ritual had evaporated, replaced not by outrage, but by absence. In a small sign of the shifting mood, the university chancellor declined to speak at the ceremony for the first time in 27 years. His official explanation cited illness. The truth, murmured among colleagues, was resignation. This pattern repeated across the empire. In Aleppo, a planned imperial commemoration was postponed indefinitely due to a lack of appropriate musical ensemble. In Nantes, the schoolchildren assigned to sing the imperial anthem performed in subdued tones. Their teacher later reprimanded for allowing non-standard phrasing. These were not acts of defiance as much as withdrawals of energy. But soon, the quiet turned kinetic. In the summer of 1897, a protest broke out in Krakow. It began not as a call for independence or secession, but as a student-led demonstration against the new educational standardization laws, which had removed Polish language textbooks from regional curricula. The protest was intended as a silent march, with black armbands and placards bearing the phrase, "Our words, our roots." But the police presence, heavy and premature, provoked confrontation. 36 students were arrested. 8 were expelled from the university. One, Alexei Wysocki, age 19, was briefly hospitalized following a baton strike. His subsequent open letter to the Krakow Herald, titled, "I Speak Therefore I Belong," became a rallying text throughout the provinces. By 1898, regional unrest had begun to take on more organized forms. In Thessaloniki, the Union for Cultural Autonomy convened its first Congress, attracting delegates from Smyrna, Alexandria, Tunis, and even Corsica. Its declared aim was modest, to advocate for cultural self-determination within the framework of the empire. Yet the tone of the proceedings, delivered in Arabic, Greek, Ladino, and French, was unmistakably assertive, a proposal to create a unified lexicon of imperial minority expressions was passed unanimously. Though the project never reached completion, its ambition revealed the shifting sands beneath imperial unity. Auguste Napoleon, now entering his second decade on the throne, responded with what he called measured clarity. He appointed a new minister of provincial affairs, Claude Michel Lancret, whose public persona combined the aesthetics of a reformer with the instincts of a disciplinarian. Lancret toured the empire extensively in 1899, delivering speeches in carefully neutral French, always preceded by ceremonial processions and escorted by local garrisons. He emphasized harmony through structure, and repeatedly invoked the metaphor of the empire as a great orchestra, each province playing its part under the guidance of a singular score. His message was aesthetically pleasing, but substantively rigid. Meanwhile, in Palermo, the Partito per l'Equilibrio Regionale had gained control of the local assembly and declared that henceforth all council proceedings would be conducted in Sicilian. This symbolic gesture prompted swift imperial response. The council's funding was suspended pending linguistic compliance, and imperial agents arrived within a fortnight to audit municipal accounts. Tensions escalated further when council members refused to allow the auditor's entry without provincial court authorization. The standoff was resolved without violence, but the memory lingered. In Cairo, students at the Imperial Technical Institute began a campaign to publish engineering manuals in Arabic. Though the manuals themselves contained little political content, mostly formulae and schematics, the act of translation was seen by metropolitan officials as a challenge to standardization. The director of the institute was dismissed in January 1900, replaced by a bureaucrat with no engineering background but an excellent record of policy adherence. By 1901, the sense of discord had become trans-imperial. Delegates from Krakow, Tunis, Sarajevo, and Algiers began corresponding directly, using encoded telegrams and traveling under assumed names to avoid bureaucratic interference. This informal network, never formalized as a single movement, became known in imperial surveillance records as the Cooperative for Responsible Expression. Its members included poets, lawyers, librarians, architects, and former civil servants. Their shared belief was simple: that governance should follow familiarity, and that communities should not require distant approval to articulate their needs. The empire, for its part, continued to insist on cohesion. The Decree on Official Vocabulary, issued in late 1902, standardized over 14,000 bureaucratic terms into French, mandating their use in all official correspondence. Exceptions were granted only for Latin in ecclesiastical contexts and Greek in theological colleges. Even municipal permit applications now required precise phrasing, rendering many local clerks effectively illiterate within their own systems. The response was swift and multifaceted. Application volumes plummeted, offices closed early citing language training, and many forms were returned blank with notes reading simply "unable to comply." In Bohemia, a subtler form of dissent emerged in the arts. The National Theatre of Prague began staging plays in constructed dialects, amalgamations of Czech, Slovak, and Polish with invented vocabulary. These linguistic experiments were widely popular but also difficult to censor, as they technically did not violate language regulations. Meanwhile, newspapers began printing dual editions, one in French for formal compliance and another in the vernacular, slipped inside for actual reading. In 1904, the empire reached what some scholars would later describe as its pre-revolutionary plateau. The machinery still functioned. Taxes were collected. Borders were patrolled. Census data was recorded. But the cultural consent, the shared dream of order, had begun to evaporate. Cities held festivals not for imperial holidays, but for local saints and poets. Provincial archives received anonymous donations of banned texts, which they quietly cataloged under fictitious entries. Even within the military, a new caution emerged. Officers requested transfers to linguistically homogeneous units, citing morale concerns. The High Command dismissed such requests as ill-advised, but did not act on them. Yet through it all, the empire remained intact. No walls had fallen, no flags had changed, but something less visible and perhaps more critical had shifted. The people had begun to imagine governance as something negotiable, mutable within reach. They had tasted the idea that authority could reside closer to home, and once tasted, such an idea is rarely forgotten. Morning broke softly over Vienna in the spring of 1906. The Imperial Council Hall, washed in the rose-gold light of dawn, awaited the arrival of Auguste Napoleon and his cabinet for what would be one of the most symbolically charged parliamentary sessions in years. On the agenda, the Act of Harmonious Representation, a sweeping legislative package meant to formalize regional linguistic and cultural exceptions without undermining central authority. The act, meticulously crafted by Minister of Law Etienne d'Orléac over the course of 23 months, contained over 200 articles, many of them phrased in oblique legal French, with parallel annotations in classical Latin, ecclesiastical Greek, and an approved Ottoman court register. The act passed with narrow approval. Applause in the chamber was polite, even reserved. But the Journal Officiel de l'Empire declared it a new constitutional renaissance, and state-run publications throughout the realm republished its preamble in local dialects, celebrating the delicate balancing of fidelity and flexibility. Behind closed doors, however, doubts lingered. The law was so complex, so filled with conditional clauses and exceptions to exceptions, that few outside the legal class understood its true implications. Local councils began requesting clarification en masse. A rumor spread that no fewer than 3 provincial ministers had resigned not in protest, but in exhaustion. In Cairo, the Grand Library received a shipment of bound volumes containing the Act of Harmonious Representation in 14 authorized formats. They were shelved in the Theoretical Governance Wing, a section rarely visited except by doctoral candidates and archivists. Yet even here, where the smell of parchment and lemon polish clung to the air like memory, a quiet shift could be detected. Marginalia in the notebooks of young scholars no longer quoted metropolitan authors exclusively. Regional philosophers, poets, and political thinkers appeared alongside the canonical names, penciled in small, careful handwriting. Meanwhile, Auguste Napoleon undertook a grand tour of the empire's heartlands, ostensibly to celebrate the Golden 20th. Beginning in Toulouse and ending in Brno, his journey lasted 6 weeks and included no fewer than 63 public appearances. Wherever he went, the atmosphere was ceremonious: chorales, student parades, theatrical pageants, but also heavy, as though participants were enacting a drama that no longer inspired full belief. The emperor's speeches were broadcast via phonograph cylinders, their polished elocution echoing through train stations and school courtyards, proclaiming unity and splendor and harmony through reverence. Yet, perhaps tellingly, the final address of the tour, delivered in Brno on a drizzly October afternoon, was not recorded. The local operator later claimed the cylinder was damaged. Some suggested it had simply been left blank on purpose. In 1908, the empire celebrated the bicentennial of the Treaty of Reunification, the foundational event of its modern form. Commemorations were elaborate. A temporary pavilion of union was constructed in Paris, its dome painted with allegorical frescoes depicting the peoples of the empire joined in peaceful labor. Farmers, scholars, sailors, and artists, all arrayed beneath a symbolic olive tree. The painter, Marguerite de Sarlat, reportedly suffered a nervous collapse midway through the commission, whispering, "I cannot find their faces anymore," as she was escorted from the scaffolding. The work was completed by students who relied on earlier sketches and their own interpretations of the theme. Amidst these acts of cultural pageantry, administrative reform continued. The Imperial Residency Index, first proposed in 1905 and implemented between 1907 and 1911, assigned a universal registration code to each imperial citizen. The aim was standardization of identity across the provinces, enabling more efficient tax collection, military conscription, and census tracking. Yet in practice, the system introduced layers of confusion, names transliterated inconsistently, religious designations recorded incorrectly, duplicate identities issued in multilingual regions. Appeals for correction took months, sometimes years. One notable case in Carthage involved a shipwright who received 3 different residency numbers over the course of 18 months, each accompanied by contradictory notices of tax obligation, jury summons, and military exemption. Culturally, the empire's artistic scenes continued to flourish, though increasingly they did so in ways that questioned imperial narratives. In Belgrade, the playwright Danilo Petrovic premiered The Marble Vineyard, a surrealist allegory of eternal bureaucratic war fought in gardens that grew only statues. Its language was elliptical and symbolic, but imperial censors nevertheless demanded revisions, which Petrovic refused. The play ran for 5 nights before being shut down. Tickets for the final performance were torn in half by audience members before the curtain rose, a silent gesture now commemorated in mural form on the side of the Royal Conservatory. Elsewhere, more subtle expressions of fragmentation emerged. In Lyon, the Concord bookstore began filing works by authors' province of origin, rather than language or genre. In Thessaloniki, the city's music conservatory began incorporating Armenian and Berber scales into its composition curriculum. In Prague, the modernist architectural collective known as Sched, the Center, published a manifesto claiming that true symmetry requires the liberty to be asymmetrical. Politically, challenges multiplied. The 1912 provincial elections saw the lowest turnout in recorded history. In Tunis, barely 14% of eligible voters participated. The local prefect blamed unusually high tides and dust in the polling apparatus. But privately, the Ministry of Internal Affairs acknowledged a broader malaise. Voter rolls were outdated, candidates were viewed as metropolitan puppets, and more than one polling station was reportedly staffed by civil servants unable to communicate with voters due to linguistic mismatches. One ironic incident in Sarajevo involved ballots printed entirely in Catalan, the result of a bureaucratic copy error from Tarragona. Through all of this, the empire's core institutions continued to function, but not without strain. The Imperial Audit Office reported an increase in internal duplications of record, citing the example of one tax declaration that had been filed, processed, and archived simultaneously in 4 separate regional centers, each unaware of the others. The Imperial Railway Authority published timetables in 27 dialects, often resulting in contradictory arrival times at border stations. Passengers began carrying pocket glossaries simply to board correctly. By the summer of 1914, a strange tension had taken root across the imperial domain. It was not the tension of imminent collapse, but of overextended preservation, the sense that something vast, once organic, was now kept upright by sheer force of ceremony and memory. Boulevards gleamed, train carriages arrived punctually, newspapers published editorials on the moral dignity of cohesion. Yet in cafes and salons, whispers grew more pronounced. Beneath oil portraits of past emperors, patrons spoke in undertones of division, of self-rule, of alternatives. And thus, the stage was set, not for disaster, not yet, but for the kindling to gather where eyes were not watching. In Sarajevo, a student began keeping a private notebook of revolutionary poetry. In Alexandria, an engineer proposed a networked wireless for independent civic broadcasts. In Trieste, a retired general met with former separatists just to talk. Evening settled gently over Sarajevo on the 27th of June, 1914. The streets were quiet, touched by a stillness so complete it felt as though the city itself had momentarily forgotten to breathe. In an upper room near the Miljacka River, a young man named Vidan Iliev copied by hand a final stanza from his notebook of poems, ink still faintly damp on the page. Outside, the shadows elongated across the cobbled avenues, their edges soft as the breath of sleep. The world in all its intricate machinery remained unaware that a single turning of its gears had drawn closer to a moment from which no serene restoration would be possible. By morning, the calm would shatter. By noon, the fissures long hidden beneath ceremonial harmony would begin to rupture in earnest. It began, as many great unravelings do, not with the roar of armies, but with the silence that precedes them, the quiet hesitation of disbelief. The attempted assassination of Prince Michel Antoine of the House of Lucerne-Valois during his inspection tour in Sarajevo did not succeed, yet it did not fail entirely either. The bomb that missed the carriage by mere feet injured 2 aides and caused a diplomatic sensation. The young student responsible, Ilyev himself, was captured after fleeing to the cathedral crypt, where he had sought symbolic asylum beneath the ancient stone vaults. He surrendered without resistance, quoting a line from one of his poems as he handed over the pistol. "Only in silence do empires confess." The empire's response was swift, measured, and devastating. An official communiqué, released within 48 hours, accused foreign anarchist influence and demanded formal inquiries from the Hungarian and Anatolian assemblies. Imperial troops were placed on heightened alert across the Slavic territories. Auguste Napoleon, deeply shaken by the event, some claimed he wept privately in the chapel of St. Arnaud, convened an emergency conference of the Imperial Circle invoking Article 16 of the Concord Accords for the first time in half a century. The press naturally oscillated between sensationalism and restrained patriotism. Le Moniteur declared the incident an affront to the sacred unity of our civilization. In Constantinople, La Gazette Sublime hinted darkly at perfidious separatists poisoning the roots of empire. But in smaller journals, especially in Alexandria, Trieste, and Thessaloniki, a more somber tone prevailed. "It begins," wrote a columnist in Echo des Rives, "not with declarations, but with the crumbling of the myth that we could stand outside the world's convulsions. For as it happened, the empire's internal crisis coincided with the final ignition of a broader conflagration. The Germanic Confederation, long in a strategic competition with the Russian League, had begun the mobilization of its northern frontiers. The assassination, or attempted assassination, served not as the cause, but as the pretext. Treaties, decades old, were invoked. Armies moved not in passion, but in obedience to lines drawn long ago. Within weeks, all of Europe was engaged in what was first called La Grande Campagne Défensive, the Great Defensive Campaign, though history would rename it the First Global Conflict. The Napoleonic Empire, despite its careful efforts to remain a balancing power, found itself drawn inevitably into the vortex. An alliance with Britain, reinforced through the Mediterranean Protocols of 1883, obliged the empire to defend maritime trade routes from German interference. More significantly, long-standing commitments to protect Anatolia from Russian encroachment compelled direct involvement. By September 1914, imperial troops had been dispatched to Thrace, the Levant, and the Rhine corridor. Yet this mobilization did not mirror the smooth, ceremonious operations of past decades. Confusion reigned in the provincial administrations. Railway timetables clashed with military requisitions. Multilingual commands led to misinterpretation among conscripts. Some regiments arrived at staging areas lacking equipment, others with the wrong orders entirely. In Thessaloniki, a whole brigade was mistakenly shipped to Alexandria, where they were assigned temporary duties in port maintenance rather than combat. Letters from soldiers described endless drills, erratic supplies, and the eerie absence of clear objectives. By early 1915, the conflict had ceased to resemble anything orderly. The Rhine offensive stalled in freezing rains. In Anatolia, the Imperial Army's 11th Division became trapped in a mountain pass for 17 days, surviving on powdered milk and prayer. The Levantine front devolved into trench warfare. Gas masks, first introduced experimentally, became mandatory. News from the front lines arrived in bursts of euphemism: strategic pause, tactical reallocation, heroic holding pattern. Behind the phrases lay a different truth: attrition, exhaustion, disillusionment. Back home, the imperial apparatus strained under the weight. The Imperial Residency Index, once heralded as a triumph of bureaucratic unification, collapsed under the demands of conscription and rationing. Food supplies dwindled. Bread queues formed in cities once famed for their abundance. In Alexandria, the Grand Library opened its doors at night not for research, but to shelter the homeless and hungry. By spring, its luminous reading halls had become makeshift infirmaries. Yet perhaps the most profound damage was not logistical, but spiritual. The myth of the empire, harmonious, enlightened, civilized, had relied upon a delicate equilibrium of belief. It was belief, not law, that had bound Alexandria to Algiers, Prague to Damascus. But as the war dragged on, that belief faltered. Soldiers from Tunis wondered aloud why they were dying in forests near the Oder River. Miners from Charleroi refused to extract ore for weapons they would never wield. Intellectuals in Krakow and Lyon published manifestos questioning the legitimacy of a central command that seemed distant and mute. The imperial parliament, paralyzed by regional disputes, convened only 3 times during the entirety of 1916. Proposals for decentralized war councils were blocked. A joint letter from 6 regional governors requesting increased autonomy was dismissed without reply. One delegate, in frustration, tore up his own identity ledger during a live broadcast from the assembly floor. His words, "We are not codes, we are voices," became a slogan chalked on walls from Marseille to Mosul. Auguste Napoleon, once the symbol of serene continuity, grew increasingly reclusive. His addresses, formerly clear and rhythmic, became sporadic, then ceased altogether. Some said he was ill, others that he had simply lost faith. One rumor claimed he spent his days alone in the observatory of Val de Grace, watching the stars, whispering names from the old dynastic charts. Whether true or not, his absence was felt. By late 1917, the signs of fracture were undeniable. The Bavarian uprising in Munich, a city within the empire's sphere of influence, prompted mass protests in Vienna, where banners read, "Not our war, not our chain." In Algiers, dockworkers formed a council refusing imperial orders. Thessaloniki declared a provisional regional authority pending clarity from Paris. No clarity came. The final blow was not a battle, but an announcement. In February 1918, the Germanic Confederation and the Russian League signed a separate peace, excluding the Napoleonic Empire entirely. The move rendered the empire's sacrifices moot and stripped it of diplomatic leverage. The response was fury, but a quiet fury, the kind that does not manifest in riots or explosions, but in the slow exodus of belief. Governors stopped replying to dispatches. Provincial treasuries withheld funds. In Marseille, a former prefect lit a candle for the passing of the imperial dream and did not extinguish it until dawn. And so, by the time the armistice was signed in July of that year, not by imperial decree, but by a coalition of surviving ministries, the empire remained, but only in name. Its symbols still adorned coins, still graced documents, still flew from crumbling flagpoles. But the idea, the living unity beneath those symbols, had dissolved. The dream, once stitched across continents, now lay in threads. The final days of the Napoleonic Empire unfolded not in a single grand collapse, but rather in a slow, dignified disintegration, like the withering of leaves in late autumn, not torn from branches by a storm, but gently loosed by time's own patient hand. When the guns fell silent in the summer of 1918, the world did not erupt in joy. There were no jubilant celebrations, no triumphal parades. Instead, there was silence, deep, unbroken silence. The kind that descends over empty train stations and once crowded public squares. The empire, though still existent on maps, had entered a realm of ambiguity, not yet gone, but no longer alive in the way it had been. The administrative structures, once so impressively intricate and obsessively maintained, had begun to falter even before the armistice. Ministries functioned in name only. Clerks showed up for work without tasks. Orders were issued but seldom followed. Across the provinces, symbols of unity, the eagle insignia, the imperial standards, the uniform dialect used in official communication, remained untouched but unregarded, like old icons in a forgotten chapel. Auguste Napoleon, who had not been seen publicly since late 1917, emerged briefly in October 1918 to deliver a carefully worded address from the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. His figure appeared frail behind the ornate lectern, his voice calm but distant, each syllable enunciated with the precision of a man who no longer believed in what he was saying. He spoke of renewal, of reimagined fraternity, of civil responsibility in the twilight of conflict. But his words failed to ignite the audience. They fell like autumn rain, soft and cold, absorbed without echo. And then the monarch was gone again. Some whispered he had retreated permanently to the ancestral estate at Compiègne. Others claimed he had quietly abdicated in favor of a regency council. There were even murmurs, almost always shared in hushed tones and quickly dismissed, that he had simply disappeared, slipping out of the empire like a ghost, his departure undocumented. Official records did not confirm or deny any of these accounts. In his absence, governance passed not to a single successor, but to a loose confederation of regional administrators, ministers, and local councils. It was not revolution exactly, it was entropy. The territories began to assert autonomy not through declarations of secession, but through acts of omission. In Prague, local currencies were issued that bore no imperial seal. In Alexandria, a reconstituted Senate voted to adopt Arabic as the sole language of official proceedings. In Marseille, the port authority ceased forwarding tariffs to the imperial treasury. One by one, the threads that had bound the vast tapestry of empire loosened, not cut, but simply unknotted by the weight of neglect and indifference. Culturally, too, the unraveling was palpable. Imperial festivals were sparsely attended. The once celebrated Concord Day, commemorating the moment of unification, passed in 1920 without public fanfare. Newspapers shifted their focus from imperial policy to local concerns. Literature and theater began to reflect themes of introspection, disillusionment, and regional pride. A widely circulated pamphlet published in Lyon asked simply, "What are we now?" It contained no conclusions, only questions. Economic realignments further deepened the fragmentation. The war had drained coffers, disrupted trade routes, and left vast industrial regions in states of partial collapse. In the coalfields of Wallonia, production never recovered to pre-war levels. North African agricultural exports, once regulated by central tariffs and supported by imperial subsidies, faced competition from rising Mediterranean powers now operating with their own interests. Ports like Thessaloniki and Beirut, long integral parts of the imperial trade network, turned increasingly toward independent commercial partnerships. The old economic circuits were being redrawn, not through policy, but necessity. And yet, in this dissolution, there was no open rebellion, no widespread violence. It was not that the people no longer cared. It was that the vision of empire had faded so thoroughly from daily life that its dismantling no longer felt transgressive. It felt rather like the settling of dust. In Paris, statues of Napoleon III remained in their plazas, but pigeons perched upon them without irony. The imperial court, what little remained of it, continued to meet, but mostly for ceremonial readings and reviews of obsolete edicts. Among the few institutions that endured with a semblance of cohesion was the Imperial Academy. It had, for over a century, functioned as both a scholarly council and a civil planning board. In 1923, it released a report titled On the Matter of Transition, a document over 600 pages long. It did not advocate for dissolution, nor did it defend the imperial status quo. Rather, it outlined in excruciating detail the logistical steps required to transition administrative functions to regional authorities: education, infrastructure, healthcare, communications. It was not a political manifesto, it was a blueprint for dignified retreat. In the provinces, reactions were varied. In Krakow and Budapest, former imperial officials formed regional alliances focused on agricultural reform. In Carthage, a symposium of poets gathered to debate the philosophical implications of post-imperial identity. In Milan, the city council voted unanimously to remove the imperial crest from municipal buildings. And yet, in many hearts, there lingered a quiet nostalgia, not for control or dominion, but for the idea of something larger than oneself. The dream of unity, though no longer visible in the structures of governance, echoed faintly in lullabies, in the layout of railroads, in the very contours of the cities built under the imperial eye. The final act, if one can call it that, came in May of 1929. The Hall of Nations in Geneva, recently established as the seat of a new global diplomatic order, received a letter from the Imperial Office of Coordination. It was a simple communication, signed by a dozen mid-ranking administrators, acknowledging the ongoing reorganization of territories formerly governed under the Imperial Concord. It expressed goodwill, offered support for peaceful development, and included a short list of territorial claims the office no longer considered in effect. It did not declare the empire dissolved. It did not mention Auguste Napoleon. It ended with a single phrase: "We are grateful for the years. No parades. No treaties, no abdications." The empire, like a dream slowly fading in the early hours before dawn, simply ceased to be. And yet, its echoes endured. In architecture and language and archives still consulted by young scholars who marvel at how such a vast machine once functioned. In the stories told by grandparents who remembered the days of imperial trains and tricolor flags. In the margins of maps, where names linger a little longer than the borders that once gave them shape. The twilight of the imperial ideal was not a tragedy, but a transition, not from greatness to ruin, but from presence to memory. And in that memory, scattered and dim as it may be, something of the old dream still shimmered, a whisper through the corridors of history, saying not, "We were powerful," but "We were one." Hey everyone, tonight we bring our journey to a close by drifting slowly across the decades that followed the quiet end of the Napoleonic Empire. Imagine, if you will, a vast landscape at dawn, mist curling over long forgotten roads, stone mile markers overgrown with ivy, and buildings that once housed bureaucrats and ministers now home to libraries, markets, or silence. The empire no longer exists, at least not officially, but its legacy lingers in subtle ways, in choices made unconsciously, in borders drawn with invisible rulers, in the cadence of shared languages, and the quiet persistence of a common past. Close your eyes and picture the world after empire. Not in flames, not broken, but rearranged. 1,000 colors bleeding out from a once unified center, dispersing into new nations, federations, and alliances, each carrying fragments of the old order like dust in their lungs. It is in this landscape that we find ourselves, meandering across the 20th and 21st centuries through war, recovery, integration, and the ghost threads of identity, seeking not the rebirth of an empire, but the memory of what it once meant to be part of something vast. And as we ease into this final chapter, let us pause just briefly, if you haven't already, to close your eyes, take a breath, and ask yourself, where are you listening from tonight? Somewhere in the world touched by this alternate story, no doubt. Now, let us begin the last of our slow, meandering reflections. In the immediate years after 1930, Europe did not descend into chaos, but it did experience a gentle kind of unmooring. Without the unifying presence of the empire, regions began to explore identity anew. The former imperial provinces, now republics, principalities, and confederated states, did not entirely reject their past. Rather, they began to reinterpret it. In schools from Antwerp to Alexandria, textbooks were updated to reflect the Concord era as a historical phase, bracketed in time but not vilified. It was treated, curiously, with a mixture of nostalgia and neutrality. This cultural reckoning rippled outward in myriad ways. In Warsaw, the old imperial registry was reopened not as a government archive, but as a public museum. Visitors wandered the aisles where clerks once toiled, now populated with glass displays of ornate seals, ink-worn ledgers, and faded portraits of minor prefects. In Tunis, the Ministry of Agricultural Affairs was converted into a university for environmental studies. Its crest, once bearing the imperial eagle, left intact above the main portico, not out of loyalty, but reverence for architectural symmetry. By the mid-1940s, the world was swept into another global conflict, this time not against Napoleon, but against ideologies that bore new names and new faces. Fascism, communism, nationalism, these forces erupted not in the vacuum of empire, but in its afterimage. The territories of the former Napoleonic realm responded in different ways. Some remained neutral, others aligned with emergent power blocs, while a few attempted to revive aspects of imperial military tradition for their own purposes. It is notable, however, that despite the temptations of revival, no serious attempt was made to reconstruct the Napoleonic Concord. There was no Bonaparte pretender with mass support, no populist longing to restore the throne in Versailles. The empire, though remembered, was not missed in the way crumbled monarchies often are. It had exited history so gently that no one quite remembered how it had disappeared. And yet, traces of it remained embedded in the DNA of institutions. The League of Sovereign Cities, formed in 1956, adopted as its procedural model the Imperial Urban Assembly of 1887, borrowing heavily from its multilingual governance structure. The Pan-Mediterranean Transit Union, established in 1963, relied on old imperial rail maps that still aligned surprisingly well with present infrastructure. Even the currency reform debates of the 1980s were haunted by echoes of the Concorde franc, whose stability across centuries had created a deep psychological benchmark for financial unity. Language remained perhaps the most enduring legacy. The Concorde lingua franca, a carefully curated amalgam of French legalism, Latin clarity, and regional idioms, was never imposed but had naturally become the language of record in education and law. Though formally replaced by national tongues after the empire's disbandment, many legal systems retained its terms. Courts in Lyon, Tripoli, Zagreb, and Cadiz still referenced statutes with origins in the Codex Civique, a legal corpus first drafted under Napoleon III and revised incrementally for over a century. Beyond the administrative and linguistic, there was also the matter of collective memory. Slippery, mutable, but powerful. Films, novels, and theater pieces returned frequently to the Napoleonic century, not with triumphalism, but as a canvas for exploring questions of power, identity, and dislocation. A particularly popular miniseries in 1987, titled The Marble Bureaucrats, depicted the final decades of the empire as a slow, melancholic drama, watched by millions who saw in it not political commentary, but something deeper, a longing for coherence in a fragmented age. By the time the European integration accords began in earnest during the 1990s, echoes of the old empire returned once more to the margins of policy. It was not unusual for planners to cite precedents from conquered economic zones, or for diplomats to quote from 19th century edicts concerning multilingual representation and trans-regional arbitration. Quietly, almost subconsciously, the world was rebuilding something not unlike what Napoleon had once envisioned, not in form, but in function. Even the controversies of the early 21st century bore spectral fingerprints of the imperial past. Debates about centralized governance, cultural homogenization, and historical justice played out across parliaments that had once been provinces. Statues of Napoleon, some revered, others reviled, became lightning rods for wider social reflection. In 2015, a university in Thessaloniki hosted a conference titled Empires in Memory, where speakers debated the moral ambiguity of unification through conquest and the quiet dignity of peaceful decline. By 2025, few alive remembered the empire as anything other than a chapter in history, and yet its presence was undeniable in the ceremonial layouts of cities, in legal terminology, in trade agreements, and in educational frameworks. It had not disappeared so much as dissolved, its essence absorbed into the very bloodstream of modern civilization. If you were to walk through Paris today, not the capital of an empire, but a proud republic, you might still see buildings once dedicated to the imperial ministries. Their facades remain unchanged, their cornices still bearing the eagle, their iron gates now open to school children and researchers. The trains that glide across Europe's heartland still follow routes first designed to ferry prefects and proclamations, and in quiet libraries from Krakow to Rabat, the imperial seal is still embossed on the inside covers of dusty books, never erased, never rewritten, merely remembered. So what does it mean that Napoleon was never defeated at Waterloo? It means the world moved differently. It means the 19th century extended its reach far beyond its proper bounds. It means that empire, that vast and heavy word, took on a different flavor, one not of sudden collapse, but of slow transformation. And perhaps, in some small way, it means that unity, however complex, however flawed, left behind not just monuments and maps, but methods, metaphors, and murmurs. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, consider this. History does not vanish. It folds, it ripples, it echoes. And somewhere, in the quiet corridors of time, the empire still walks.